In this section, we'll look at drug use as part of the counterculture of the 1960s, and let's begin with pot. Certainly, pot has a really long history. It's been used throughout the ages by many cultures, and in the United States, of course, the hemp plant was used to make rope earlier in American history. The marijuana as an intoxicant was brought up from Mexico with migrant workers, and indeed the great migration of African Americans northward from places like New Orleans spread the use of marijuana in the 20th century. In the 20th century, it was first taxed and then criminalized, but it was easy to grow and easy to import, and it continued to spread. Marijuana was used by some of the beatniks in the 1950s. Of course, the counterculture took to marijuana like a fish to water. It was easy to use, widely available, and cheap, and it appeared to have a rather mellowing effect that really was welcomed by the counterculture. It was first smoked in self-rolled cigarettes, which of course became known as joints, and by the 1960s you begin to see pipes and water pipes, or as bongs, in use. And you begin to see the first head shops, which of course where you could buy the paraphernalia to smoke marijuana. By the end of the 60s, marijuana was almost like a sacrament to the counterculture. It was so widespread that some of the media was beginning to fearful that it was spreading from the young counterculture into the more adult middle class. When it came to the psychedelic drugs, of course, psilocybin had been used for a while by Native Americans. You think of the mushrooms. But when it came to the artificially created psychedelic drug, mainly LSD, that was first synthesized from a grain fungus in 1938. By the 1950s, the CIA and the military were doing research on psilocybin and LSD and mescaline and other psychotropic drugs to see if they could have any useful purpose in the Cold War. Beginning in 1959, a man named Ken Kesey had volunteered as a subject in these government and university trials of psychedelic drugs. And when the trials are over with, Kesey continued experimenting with his own, and they spread to a group of his friends who continued to use them and experiment them, and they called themselves the Merry Pranksters. There was a psychology researcher at Harvard named Timothy Leary who was also doing research on psychedelic drugs, mainly psilocybin and mushrooms. It's called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. But he began to believe that there would be tremendous use for these psychedelic drugs in psychiatry. And he actually used subjects that were in a Concord jail and in a prison system. The writer Aldous Huxley had been part of a mescaline experiment, and he wrote a book published in the 1950s called The Doors of Perception, where he kind of said that some of these psychedelic drugs could really have a useful purpose in bringing world peace. And the rock band The Doors, by the way, drew their name from this book. Of course, all of this would attract the hippie counterculture. Leary's lab was eventually shut down, and Leary began to become a sort of a public advocate for the use of these psychedelic drugs. He believed they could expand your mind, sort of expanding from what Huxley had said. He very famously in 1966 was said, "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." He also popularized the phrases, "think for yourself" and "question authority." Leary probably did more than just about anybody to popularize the use of LSD. He ended up dying in 1996. Ken Kesey also popularized the use of psychedelic drugs. Beginning in the summer of 1964, he and his merry pranksters painted up a bus and took a cross-country trip that they called the bus Further, and they were taking a trip, and That got a lot of publicity in the subculture. After their bus returned to California, they continued to popularize the use of LSD at so-called acid test. It was strongly influenced the San Francisco scene in the 1960s, especially. LSD was cheap, and you see it very common. It was in a liquid form. It also be put on blotter papers, but it people were in the counterculture along with marijuana. Acid was probably the most common drug. Heroin, meanwhile, was not as common throughout most of the 1960s. It was often perceived as a lower class drug. It's an opiate. But what ends up happening is that all the soldiers were over in Vietnam, where the opiate plants were common, and given the horrible conditions in that war and everything, heroin use expanded there, and a lot of these soldiers brought it back. Also, there was an assumption that the drug use was harmless with marijuana, and heroin was just another drug, and so it was all the same. And so what you end up having is in the late 60s is an explosion of heroin use in the United States. Heroin, of course, is much more deadly and much more dangerous than LSD or marijuana, and reports of heroin overdoses and reports of heroin addiction spread pretty quickly. And the famous struggles of some media celebrities, music stars fighting heroin certainly helped combat that scourge. Into the 70s, heroin continued to take its toll, but it was often seen as a lower class drug. When it came to cocaine, simply put, there was a short supply, and that kept prices really high throughout the 1960s, and so it wasn't as widespread. It was in more affluent neighborhoods, but wasn't as widespread. The assumption was that it was a relatively safe drug. It was, of course, later proved incorrect, but at the time it was assumed that it was safe, but it was just not widely available. It did, however, explode with better distribution networks in the 1970s. This concludes a section on drug use in the 1960s.